So we're going to start off with, well, the start. So talk through some of the process for setting this up, right? Like there's so many cliche quotes related to planning before you do anything, etc. I try not to use any of those cliche ones, and I'm trying so hard to not use that quote, fail to plan, plan to fail thing, right? So we'll talk through some of this. And again, if you've got questions, throw them in the chat. Justin will keep an eye on them, and he'll quick fire the questions at the end. There's our contact info. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I am your host. I am Tim Medin. I am the I guess I run the show here over at Red Siege. I've been pen testing for, I just looked at it, professional full-time pen tester for 11 years. Started at Fishnet back in the day, now Optiv. And I've been doing that ever since then. And lead author for the SANS 560 course. I also teach the 660 course, science faculty, pen testing for a long time. And I fixed the Leech author, and now I put X's on my slide because I typoed it. Anyway, so again, we're going to talk through the pen test process. There was a few of you who were in the Slack channel said, you know what, I'm just listening to you on the on-demand for SANS Security 560, the Network Penetration Testing and Ethical Hacking course. By the way, we got some huge updates coming with that, and then rename and some other interesting things coming down the pipe as well. So I'm excited about that. I say that not to pimp the class. That said, if you want to take the class, love to see you there. But this is sort of an excerpt. We've got a good portion of a day where we talk through some of the process and setup for a pen test. And then of course, in a class setting like that, there's like 5 days of the actual pen testing. I'm going to try to condense a lot of that, give you snippets, a cliff notes of a cliff notes, if you will, on the process for this episode. The next one, we're going to spend time on the method. So we'll talk through. I'm going to answer a lot of questions that I get regularly when it comes to pen testing. Of course, we're not going to have time to go through all the tools. I couldn't even name all of the tools in an hour. And then part 3, the piece I love to geek out with is reporting. Now, you're probably looking at it like, oh, wow, I'm not going to that. I hate reporting. Yeah. But let's talk through that. Maybe I can make your reporting work just a little bit faster, be a little bit more efficient, make it look just a little bit better. It doesn't take much to go from a mediocre looking report to one that really pops. So we'll spend some time on that. These are going to be back to back. If you're on YouTube, you can just literally watch them back to back. Although, take a break. Take a break. Now, who is the audience for this? Now, this specific piece, I tried to design this to make this as broad of a reach as possible. So, of course, it's designed for pen testers, both internal as well as third party, designed for those of you who maybe are hiring the services of penetration testers, as well as those of you who are receiving the report for pen testers. So I'm trying to bring in a number of different perspectives here and keep it kind of broad. Now, there are going to be specific pieces where we dig into one specific, hey, this piece is for the testers. This is for the people who are the recipients, etc. Again, we'll try to keep this pretty broad. One of the first things here, now this is sort of the differentiator between the checkbox test, if you will, and getting one with some value, right? You've got to understand the target. As a tester, you've got to understand the target. Frankly, if you are hiring testers, you need to understand yourself. What are you trying to do here? You need to help the testers. Yes, the testers should have more experience than you in the pen test process, but you should also guide them. Tell them, hey, this is the thing that is important to us. Help steer, help design, and help test. Now, if you're going to be receiving the pen test report, a lot of people sort of don't think about them until it's too late, until the report is delivered. But I would suggest to you, if you're going to be receiving it, say, hey, can I get involved in the process a little bit earlier? Maybe you don't want all of the meetings, but at least take a look at the sample reports, right? Ask some questions. Are you going to get the output you would like from the test? Maybe you have specific data formats. Some people love spreadsheets. Maybe you want CSV, maybe JSON or something. Oh, crazy, right? Does the output give you findings in the way that you would like? Does it give you a remediation plan in the way that you like? Whatever it might be, we want to incorporate the testees. Now I say that, it sounds a little bit worse than when I wrote it. The people being tested as well as the recipients, get them all involved to help design the test and frankly select the testers. If it's an internal group of testers, you can help design the way that they test and the data they give to you, right? You're going to have a little bit less of an impact there with third parties, but internal say, look, folks, we work together. We need you to alternate the way, change the way you work to some degree so that we can get the data that's important to us and then make the correct decisions as well as the best remediations. So of course, the sort of cliche-ish thing here is you got to plan up front, right? And this is a lot bigger. Take a step back. This is a very high level, but we need to understand, like, why the heck are we doing this? What are the risks to the organization? We need goals for the test. And it's not just do a test. I mean, we've unfortunately done plenty of those, but we would like to look for the real world risks and frankly, the risks that are most important to the organization. In fact, as a tester, I highly recommend asking some basic questions up front, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I love this quote here from J.R.R. Tolkien. It does not do to leave a dragon out of your calculations if you live near him, right? You've got to take into account the big risks to your organization, the big risks to your data, the specific data. So take that step back. We're not just doing a pen test. We want a pen test that looks specifically at credit card information, healthcare information, whatever it may be. But we've got to help steer this, and this is on the people hiring the test or the targets rather, whether it be internal or third-party testers. It's on you to help the testers understand what their goals to be. And of course, if you're a tester, you need to be aware of what are my goals? What am I going after? Because these vulnerabilities, I'm going to talk, of course, about those a lot in the reporting section, but these vulnerabilities do not exist in a vacuum, right? These vulnerabilities exist in the context of the organization, in the context of the data, the PII, the PHI, the intellectual property, whatever it may be. And just having a significant vulnerability on a system doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the highest or most critical risk. Could be a development system that just burned and rebuilt for testing. In that case, there's no data lost. Or there could be a moderate severity vulnerability, but it's a very critical system because of the data that is on it or traverses that system. And now that vulnerability is now more severe and rated more highly. We have to have that context to deliver a high quality test. So goal focused. Now, as a tester, we oftentimes like to think that we're pretty smart, and by and large, most of us are. So it's really easy for us to assume that we know all of the answers. Well, that's not a good thing, right? It's so much better to ask the dumb questions. And I keep harping on this. There's like one common thread that I keep bringing up in quite literally every conversation is be less confident. The most experts that I know are more than happy in a meeting to say, I don't know. I don't have an answer here. But I see that the more inexperienced junior, less mature, who are like, I know the answer and it's absolutely this, right? Be less certain. Never assume. So if I'm going to go, for example, and do a test, and this is a little bit more on the tester side, ask the dumb question. Ask, hey, you know what? And you can qualify it too, so it's a little bit safer. You say, you know what? I can guess, but I really don't like being wrong. What is the most important data, process, if lost, stolen, compromised, that would cause the greatest risk to your organization? And 99 times out of 100, maybe not quite that high, the answer the target gives to the tester is exactly what we would expect. But then we have to worry about that one other one, right? That one other one, we're like, oh my gosh, I wouldn't have thought about that. I have my favorite story. This is where I most internalized this. We were doing a test for a very large, think of it like an Amazon, but for tools. And we're doing the test. And I was young, a bit naive, and I knew what was important to them. In my mind, the important pieces were credit card information, client information, maybe the sales information, and I was ready to rock and roll. But the guy pulled me aside and said, hey, Tim, the important information here is something else. And I'm in my head, I'm like, yeah, no, there's a couple other things. They're on my list too. He's like, the most important thing for us is the price at which we sell things. Absolutely blew my mind. Completely blew my mind. Because, and in my mind, like I'm so confused. I am absolutely baffled by this. And I'm a very sarcastic person. And in my mind, I'm like, bro, this thing is on what's called the internet. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the internet, but it's all publicly accessible. And as my brain is, thank goodness, properly filtering this, and I'm not saying this to the client or the target, it's like, yeah, if a competitor was able to steal the price at which we sell everything, I shouldn't say steal, but obtain the price at which we sell everything, all they have to do is sell it for 1 cent less. Because the same wrench from the same vendor, right, the ultimate creator of that said wrench, why do I care where I get it from? Right? I'm going to buy it from the cheapest vendor, and that would put them out of business. Since then, every single time I ask that basic question. And if you are the person being tested, you know, this doesn't have to necessarily be a trap, although it's a good sort of way to gauge the experience and maturity of the testers to some degree. But you can just lead with it and say, hey, look, these are the important pieces here. That's great. You are giving information to the testers to, you know, make them more goal focused. And maybe you do have to, you pull in some of the other recipients here, not just the security people receiving the test. So we need to understand the why as well. What's my motivation? Why are we doing the test? Is it for compliance? I mean, if it's a PCI test, there's some very specific boxes that need to be checked, and the scoping is relatively straightforward. If it's some other type of compliance, there's other systems that will be in scope and out of scope, and specific findings that are more related to the particular types of compliance. Is it just a general test? Are we looking for, you know, the real world security concerns? Who's the audience? Who's going to be receiving this? That's going to come up when we get to our last piece when we talk through reporting. Is this report going to go straight to the technical people? Is there executives? How high up are those executives? Because the executive summary, if we get way too technical, we're going to absolutely lose executives. And it can be hard to write the same single report with a target of two very different audiences, the technical folks as well as the non-technical folks, the business folks. Other things to ask is like, hey, what are your security goals? What are your recent initiatives? If during this test, like we're not able to recover any passwords because the target has just moved to 15-character passwords, great. Call that out. Well done. to you for this initiative because it made the test significantly harder. Again, we'll talk more about that in the reporting portion of the test. So understanding helps tailor the test. It was really funny. One time, I was on the phone with a potential client, and the client was asking about us a little bit, and I flipped it and said, hey, one of the first questions I like to ask is, what's the data that's most important to you and your organization? And the auditor responded that that's irrelevant. And I was like, well, it really does help us focus the pen test. It gives us a way to add context to these vulnerabilities and adjust accordingly. He's like, that's irrelevant. It's like, oh, okay. We are at a price point where we very much tailor the service for you. I mean, you can get the Ford Pinto or the Ferrari. They will both get you from point A to point B, but it's going to be a very different experience. And he's like, I'm with the Pinto. And at that point, I was like, well, and I tried to explain some more on the differences. Like, if we find a vulnerability, if we understand the context, we find this data. I don't know if this data is important or not. He's like, it's completely irrelevant. All pen tests are just a commodity. They're all the same. All the processes, all the tools, they're all the same. It's like, well, some of the processes and tooling is the same, but there's a lot more sort of art here. He's like, I don't care. Just give me the Pinto. And in fact, I don't even really want to report. And at that point, I was like, look, if you are expecting this really cheap checkbox report, we're not going to be the people for you. We're not going to be at the price point where that's going to make sense. And I cut him off. I said, look, this is not going to be a match for us. I think we're just not going to match. And if you've got any questions, you've got my email. But with this, I'm going to end the call. I hung up on him because it was just not going to be something that was going to be good for them. It was going to be a waste of their resources. They just wanted the checkbox. Frankly, if you just want the checkbox, there are people out there, folks out there who will do a pen test, which is a vuln scan essentially, and give you results, and it's much, much cheaper. If that's what you're looking for, go with the cheapest one, obviously, right? There's no reason to pay for the more expensive one if you don't want those results, right? It's a much longer discussion, of course, right? So what do you need for testing, right? Well, the scope. What is in scope? Well, that goes back a little bit to our discussion on what is the test for, right? Is it for compliance? Is it for PCI? If it's for PCI, then, well, clearly we know these are the systems. This is the CDE. This is the data. This defines the scope. The other common thing is the type of test. Now, you as the tester may need to coach the people receiving the test to help them decide what works best for them. Now, if you have worked with a bunch of pen tests, if you have acquired them, again, internal pen testers or third party, and you've got the experience and you know what you want, throw that out there. Makes life much, much easier. And between these two, once you have one, it helps define the other. The rules of engagement, pretty straightforward. It usually gets a little bit funkier, maybe around social engineering or something. But scope, rules of engagement, big thing. Let's spend some time first here on the various test types. Now, this goes back to the organizational goals. Is this a compliance test? Is it a general security test? Did something happen in the organization? Or like, you know what? We have a custom web app and we just lost a bunch of data to that web app. So let's beat up this web app. Hey, we've got a brand new initiative, a new mobile app, a new API. We need to test that. Hey, we're working our way up the maturity scale. We would like to move to an assumed breach, a red team, whatever it may be, right? So the organizational goals define those tests. And if you don't sit back and listen, you're going to design it incorrectly. So various test types, of course, we've got the standard internal and external tests. The assumed breach, I could literally talk for hours about the assumed breach test. In fact, I and Mike both have done that. We've got the links here accordingly. AB1 is the one I think I did it, and AB2 might be one that Mike did. Mine's a little bit more high level, whereas Mike's talk, you can check that our SiegeCast out. It is going to be up on YouTube as well. Mike talks through a lot more of the tools. Tim has the same little box he talks in during the class demo. Yeah, that's awesome. Egress filtering. Hey, are we trying to test if an attacker gets in? Can we detect them on the way out or stop them? Now, don't forget. I mean, the protection is great, but it's never going to happen. You are never going to hit 100% protection, so you have to have detection. Right? Red teams, purple teams. Now, a lot of times we get people that come to us with we want a red team, and it's largely because it's a buzzword. And we say, hey, hold on. What are you actually looking for? Because these red teams, a proper red team is quite expensive. 6+ person weeks of time. You're talking 60, 70 grand at the minimum plus. And most of the time, people don't necessarily need that. It's just a fancy term that they've heard, where an assumed breach might be better. Frankly, it's just an internal vulnerability assessment. A VA, like literally, there was an organization I was talking to, and they had never done any security, offensive security ever, and they wanted a red team. And I was like, well, that's a little misguided, right? I've had people say, hey, Tim, can we get a red team web pen test? What? I'm not even sure what that is. I don't respond to them. I'm like, just tell me more about what are you trying to do, right? Go back to the earlier pieces, understand what is trying to go. What they're trying to do, what are their goals, right? Phishing, social engineering, is that on the table? A lot of organizations say, hey, we want to test this. I think the phishing, a good way to test that, again, assume breach. I love me some assume breach. Saves the time with the assume breach, or with the red team, split it up into a phishing, see how many people click, and then simulate this is what would happen after if someone were to click. We've actually got a couple of different presentations on the web app and API. That's a whole deep area. We've got one of our folks, Jason, is digging deep into web apps. He's relatively new in that arena, and he's trying to soak it up like a sponge. There's a ton of stuff out there. It's very much its very own discipline. And of course, there's tons of other test types here as well. But again, this goes back to understand the target. And if you are the target, work to understand yourself. And this can be a conversation where you talk to different people in your organization. What is our organizational goals? Talk to the testers. What do you recommend based on what you're seeing in the real world? Talk to your incident response people and say, hey, look, we're seeing a lot of this. Can we test this specific thing and see what happens inside of our organization? Scope, right? The scope, the simple version of the scope is, well, that is the time and money. And even if you're internal, there is some bean counter somewhere that is tracking the internal hours back to some internal rate. Right? So even if you're internal to the organization, someone is doing the math on that and say, hey, what's the value on this? Because your resources are finite. Right? Your time is finite. You have a wage, you have probably benefits and other things in there too, right? And there's math, and we need to figure out what is the optimal amount of effort versus benefit. Now, I like to ask what's in scope, but also what is out of scope. Now, technically, that is the same question. If I ask you what's in scope, you should give me a list. If I say what's out of scope, you should say, well, the opposite of that. But invariably, you ask this question, like, what's in scope? This network, and this network. What's out of scope? Oh, we've got a database server in there that's really, really sensitive, a mainframe. We've got some other things where they're like, oh, wait, these shouldn't be in scope. And if you're hiring the testers, again, whether it be internal, external, whatever, talk to your people and say, hey, what are there things that we shouldn't test? because we've seen this before. We just had a test with a hospital, and I was absolutely terrified of accidentally touching a medical device that was hooked up to a human. Terrified. There was one night where I woke up in the middle of the night, like in a panic. It scared the crap out of me. I was talking to a sister organization, one of the leadership at another organization where they just did one at a hospital. And one thing about hospitals, if you don't know, they just throw crap wherever. They just plug it all into the same subnet. So you might have, like, next to the accounting computer is a medical device, next to, like, network wise. So we had to tighten that up and be very, very careful to tightly define some of that scope. Is it owned by somebody else? We were doing a test a number of years ago. This was at a previous organization, a very large company. We were doing a very specific piece of the test, but there was another contractor that was tasked with looking at the Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi was absolutely massive at this organization. And we, frankly, if all of our staff would have worked on the Wi-Fi, we would have had, like, everybody taken for almost a year. It was crazy. So we were in the same discussions because it's still the same part of the same test. And somebody from the hiring organization, the target company, said, "Hey, these systems, this Wi-Fi controller, it's owned by such and such." And the prime, we were the subcontractor, the prime's like, "Okay, cool, we'll just test all that." And I remember Josh Wright and I looked like, and we're like kind of fidgeting in our seats. And we're like, and then finally Josh is like, if that's owned by somebody else, you can't test it and you can't give authorization because you probably don't have it. You're gonna need additional paperwork. This is really awkward because they're like these, mega companies, and we're this tiny little company, and we're like running the meeting for them. It was fascinating. It was a tremendous learning experience, right? Other times I talk to potential targets, and they say, "We want a real world test." Cool. What does that mean? Right? The real world. Okay. The solar wind, according to the stats, the solar winds attack had 1,000 engineers to create the code. At no point in time has there been any organization that I've ever talked to who's like, "You know what? We will give you budget for 1,000 software developers to work on code for a year." No. But if you are that organization, let's talk, please. I will drop this call right now and we can talk. Right, the attackers have darn near an infinite amount of time. And you're not going to give me an infinite amount of money. That said, there's a caveat. I like money. We should hang out. Little idiocracy reference there. But we need to set a realistic goals here. What are the realistic goals, and how much time should we spend? There's, of course, trade-offs. If we spend, 50 weeks on this thing, are we going to get significantly more and better results than if we spent 5? Right? Who knows? That's part of the discussion. This is on the testers. It's also on the people receiving the test. And if your testers aren't willing to say, "Hey, we can scope that back and save you kind of some money," we want to make sure that they're working for you and not just working to take as much work necessarily as possible. All right, so rules of engagement. Now, this is usually pretty straightforward. I'd like to break it down to a couple of scenarios just to clarify this slide a little bit. Literally, we say, "Hey, look, these are the types of things we're going to do." And essentially, the contract is the permission. Now, there might be some additional discussions about, well, what are some things that we shouldn't do at all, or we should get additional approval? One of those things is password guessing. Password guessing is tremendously useful, but password guessing can lead to lockouts. In fact, on our last SiegeCast, the AMA, each one of us talked through a mistake that we've made during our pen tests. And I think 2 people picked lockouts with the passwords. Bad things can happen with passwords. Now, we do our best. We work really hard to make sure these things don't happen, but there's still unique scenarios where things can go wrong. And when you're wording this is more of a note to testers, or maybe it's the internal people selling it to management. There's a lot of value in testing for weak passwords. I highly encourage you to do some of that. So don't just throw that away. And a lot of this sort of comes down to selling it to a degree. Maybe I shouldn't word it that way, but I mean, defining the motivation. If I came to your organization as a tester and said, hey, we want to test passwords, we might lock things out. Is that okay? No. They're going to say no, absolutely not. But if I came to the organization and said, hey, one of the most common attacks we see these days is password reuse, use of bad passwords. What we would really like to do is attack that. How can we work with you best to reduce the likelihood of password resets, or password lockout rather? And the organizations say, cool, let's figure this out. So there is a sales technique, if you will, on how can we make this work best for everybody, right? Other riskier things. Maybe there's a specific exploit that we would like to try. And that exploit, it has a slightly increased likelihood of something going wrong. Do we have a maintenance window and we can just test during that? Do we want to have someone from the target on the phone as we do the test? Whatever it may be, define some of those thresholds. And what it typically means is this is pushed onto the tester to know what is potentially more risky than not. An important thing to remember here is things can always go wrong. You can take the absolute most care, things can go wrong. And I've had organizations come to me and they're like, we need you to guarantee you won't take a system offline. And I immediately flip it around. I'm like, what's your SLA? And they're like, I don't know, three nines or whatever, that's 17 sigmas or whatever the hell it is. It's not 100%. I'm like, okay, so let me get this straight. Your SLA is not 100%, but you want me to guarantee that your SLA is 100%. And they're like, yeah, no, that's totally different. Not really. If a system goes down while I'm testing, who's going to be blamed? Right here. 100% of the time. Because Tim wasn't here last week. Tim is here this week. Something went wrong. It is Tim's fault. And we've seen this. Mike is probably, if he's here, like this has happened where we've had proof that it wasn't us, but that doesn't matter. Who cares? Someone at the target is upset because something bad happened, and it's like it was clearly Mike's fault, and it absolutely wasn't. But who cares, right? There's no like court that says yes, Mike was right. That doesn't matter. Their perception of what you did now impacts their perception of you in the test. Testers in general, future tests that they're going to do. So we always try to set that expectation. Like, look, we do our best to make sure nothing bad happens, but it can happen because systems crash on their own. And of course, we're doing things these systems weren't designed to do. And again, go back and check the Ask Us, the AMA, if you will, SiegeCast that we did before. The link is on the screen. Other things to plan for. This part's relatively straightforward. Contact numbers and the backups. So, hey, if we're testing and we find somebody else is already there, I need to get a hold of somebody and get a hold of somebody very, very quick. Similar We had clients call us and say, look, are you doing this particular thing? And we're like, no. And they're like, okay, stop the test. Somebody else is already in, or something else bad is happening. Stop the test. So we need those emergency contacts. And if you've got longer tests, maybe you want regular discussions. If it's a week or two, we see less often that that's the case, but you as the people receiving the test, decide up front. If it provides value to you, set up a call. Now, don't be one of those people who has meetings for the sake of meetings. If the meeting could just be an email, make it an email. I'm very anti-meeting. There's always the interesting discussion on rotating testing organizations. It's not even a humble opinion. In my opinion, this is a dumb idea and it needs to die. If you are getting what you want, keep it. If you're getting the results that you want, if you're getting the reports that you like, if you're working with the people that you like, why rotate? There's paperwork. Why? It's like saying, you know what? I went to this doctor one time for a sore throat. I am never going back to that person again. Or I will wait 3 years before I go back to that doctor again. The nice thing with testing at the same organization is you can get a longitudinal look. Hey, last year, you had this password policy issue. You still have this password policy issue. This is a leadership failing. This is no longer a technical failing. I mean, technically it was a leadership, but this is a much bigger leadership failing. Now you're probably thinking like, well, this is pretty self-serving because Tim's a pen test company, wants people coming back. Yeah, but when we started not too long ago, we had no clients. The only clients we had were because they switched from other pen test companies as part of their rotation and they happened to pick us. So literally, if people had listened to this sagely advice, we never would have been in business in the first place. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents here is this seems very misguided. I don't get it. Maybe what you do instead of switching entire testing companies, ask for another tester at the same organization. Again, assuming you're getting what you want. If you're not, there's no reason, of course, to do this. And again, I'm trying to tell you this isn't just self-serving because we would be out of business if people actually listened to this advice. All right, so let's break this down. We talked about our 3 different groups up front. So we're going to briefly talk to each one of these groups. So things targets should do. So these are responsibilities largely for the people being the target of the test. Know what you want. We talked about this earlier. Now, if it's your first time, you don't necessarily know what you want. That's okay. Just make sure you're working with testers who are going to work with you and not just, we're here to do a test. Where do we deliver the report? See ya. Right? Know what you want. Also, know your process. And this is a huge thing that happens, and it's probably anybody that's worked in consulting has encountered this. Like we get people all the time like, we need a pen test. Cool. When do we need it? Next week. Not happening. Not happening. The pipeline is out longer than that. They're like, we need a test next week. All right. How do we get onboarded? Well, we have to go through our procurement process. Cool. How long does that take? 6 months. 6 minus a now. Like, that's not going to work. You've got to understand the procurement process. And I'm not trying to pick on the procurement people. The procurement people, they're doing their job. Right? Maybe it's a higher level structural thing, but the actual person on the procurement team, they're just doing their job. Similarly, you can't just chuck this over a wall at a procurement person to take care of. I was literally yesterday working through an RFP where the pen test went through the procurement people, and there were a lot of technical questions that the procurement person couldn't answer. And in fairness, they shouldn't know those answers. If they did, they should be in a different job. And we were asking questions. There was another organization asking similar questions, and the answers we were getting back were not helpful at all. Like literally, the difference in this quote was 8 times different based on how they answered a couple of questions, and they didn't answer the question. So I'm like, oh, here's 2 quotes. This one's 8 times more than the other one. And they're like, why is it so much more expensive? It's like, well, we need details here. It's like, well, we provided you details, but you didn't. Literally yesterday as well, there was another RFP for a different company. This was I think it was an insurance company or something. And I was confused on some questions. A couple of technical people jumped on the phone with the procurement people, hammered out the questions in 15 minutes, done. Everyone's on the same page. So make sure you work with those people. If your processes or something inside your organization prevent that, fight it, or else you're just not going to get what you expect. I've got a friend of mine who works for the government, and this isn't an anti-government rant by any stretch, but they were trying to get a cracking rig, and they spec'd it out. It went to procurement, and instead of the Linux system with this specific video card, they got a Windows system with 2 less of a knockoff video card that was completely useless for cracking, right? So you got to make sure that you work to get what you need. Also understand, hey, look, if you're looking for Q4, if you're going a third party, it's absolutely insane. If it's internal, understand there are certain times of the year where it's going to be busy or you can't test. I have friends on the Walmart red team, and they can't test in November until I think halfway through January. So if you've got some sort of internal thing that says we have to test this by the end of the year, well, congratulations, you're not, right? So understand your organization to some degree, right? Another thing, this sounds obvious, but when it comes to the contacts, know your vacation schedule. This one baffles me. I was doing a test in Minnesota one time, physical, I was on site, and talked to the gentleman on Friday to confirm everything, showed up on Monday, and his assistant said, oh, he's on vacation this week. What? We talked on Friday. Like everybody on Friday knows that they're not going to be here on Monday because they are super excited and they're going to do a little dance on their car on the way out, right? Maybe flip people the bird, whatever it might be, but they're gone. You don't forget that. And then we showed up. We're like, well, what are we supposed to do? We didn't have key card access. In this case, the target said, oh, we'll just follow somebody in. So we did. We tailgated the entire week. And we put that in a report. And they were pissed. And we're like, look, this is bonus content in a report. You told us you wanted a security assessment. Cool. Anybody can get in your building because your controls. There were so many failings here. It was interesting. All right. Things testers should do. Well, as a tester, be helpful. It's really easy for the tester to be superior or cocky in a way, like, hey, I just beat you up. Right? I just kicked the crap out of your organization because I know things you don't know. Cool. You are here as a teacher. You are not here to shame anybody. You're not here to make them look bad. Your goal is to make them better. And frankly, if you fail to do so, you are a waste of time and money. I wouldn't say useless. You actually have a negative value because useless means there's no benefit and it's kind of no cost. But if you provide no value and you cost money, you literally have a negative value. So spin this in your head like, hey, how can I help? I've got this finding. How can I help them get better? Because the last thing I want to see, me personally, is any of the organizations that I've ever pen tested getting a breach. I don't care if they're with Red Siege or if any of my previous companies, I don't want to see it. Because to some degree, I feel sort of responsible. So my goal is to help make them better. Now, will they always take my advice? Absolutely not. No way. But I'm going to do my best. I'm going to put things in the context to help them get better, to help them make the choices, the secure choices. And that's what I'm here for. And we see this a lot, especially maybe in the older security conferences, where someone will get up on stage and just absolutely rip the target organization to shreds and make fun of them. You know, someone made a mistake. Right? Don't shred somebody. Help them get better, right? Point some of that out though as well. All right, recipients, what you got here? So these are the people receiving the test. They're probably not going to be involved with a lot of the test scoping necessarily, but these are the people who, after the test, are going to be cleaning up. This is a piece where you need to go back to the front of the entire test and say, what am I going to get? What's in it for me? Because realistically, this whole test is about this group of people. They're going to be implementing the changes. They're going to be making the changes that make the organization more secure. What helps them do that? Is there a different report format where one group can do that better than another? Is it, hey, I need you to give it to me in a specific format because it's easier for us to ingest? So ask the testers also afterwards. And this always surprises me. Of course, as a third-party tester, you can do this internally as well, but use your testers as a resource. If you're paying somebody a pile of money and you've got questions, ask. Set up a debrief call. Send them emails. If you've got internal testers, even better, get them on the horn. Help them help you make the right decisions. Use the resources you have available and make sure ahead of time you are getting what you are intending to get. So that is going to largely wrap up part one. Next time in part two, we're going to talk through the method. So we're going to cram essentially like 5 or 6 days of my SANS Security 560 into about an hour. We'll see how that absolutely happens. And then the week after, or if you're on YouTube, another link to the side, we're going to talk through reporting. And we've got the registrations that here, the links here. Afterwards, if this is a recording, you can still go to these specific links. It will take you to the slides as well as the other recording. All right. Finally, again, if you've got any pen test needs, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. And with that, I will turn it over to the lovely Justin.
Lovely.
You're
lovely.
muted.
I am.
Yeah. Well, before you called Mike lovely, not so much Corey, but it's okay.
Wait, am I muted or no?
You're good now.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, I try to be lovely as possible. Okay. We got a few questions. We're gonna bang through these real quick. First question. So you kind of actually already ended up doing this, but if you have any other stories of ask the dumb question, do you have a real life story showcasing this? Now you asked this before you went into your point, but do you happen to have another one that really kind of sells that on the top of mind?
I can't think of another one that sums it up as well as that one.
Yeah.
That one just nailed it for me because I forgot to add before for during that test, we came across the pricing information, and if I hadn't asked it, well, I didn't ask the question. If they hadn't told me, I would have seen that and been like, well, this is already on the internet. Why do I care? And I would have blown right past it. But because I was now armed with that knowledge and it affected my goals, now I'm like, ooh, the steps that got me here are bad. Let's talk about this. Let's discuss this in the context for the report.
Ghoski's mentioning this one where you I don't know about the story, but you said that you did a pen test on the wrong company and they thanked you.
No, that wasn't me. That was
Oh, that's Corey. That's Corey's story, isn't it?
Rob Fuller.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's a Darknet Diaries episode. I think it's like episode 22, where Rob, they did a test of an organization. Turns out they had slightly typoed the IP address. The other organization had a very similar spelt name in the same line of work, and they got in and had to have that chat. So Darknet Diaries, by the way, fantastic.
All right, so we have a question from Chevy. He says, I have an internal pen test coming up. The goal is to attack this internal Windows VM to test the implementation of AppLocker. If I have an attacker machine connected to the internal network, what would the first thing Tim would do to attack this internal VM?
Yeah, so I mean, it's essentially you're testing AppLocker at this point. So the key here with tests like this is you want successes and failures. So try the things that you think are not going to work. Like let's download a random executable and try to run that. Does it execute? Beyond that, then try a lot of what's called the LOL bins, live off the land binaries. They are executables inside of Windows that you might be able to springboard off of to get what you're trying to accomplish.
So when things go wrong during engagements, what usually happens? Just apologize or give the clients a credit?
Say that again.
Yeah. So it says, when things go wrong during engagements, what usually happens? So I guess maybe a mistake or something. Do you just apologize, or do you give the clients a credit, or what happens?
Yeah, I mean, we've never had to do any sort of refunds or credits or anything like that. At that point, you just discuss, and it's in the contract. Everyone knows up front, assuming you're doing it right, up front that things can and will go sideways. You end up jumping on a call. Sometimes you end up eating a little crow because you made a mistake, but you go on. Now, in my case, because we're a third-party company, they might not come back to us, right? If you're internal, maybe there's potential for negative impact to your career. The short answer is, it is what it is. You just address it and move on. Now, there have been sometimes, there was one test that we had done. So we were doing an external vulnerability assessment. So we were scanning from the outside, and the vulnerability scan. Now, let me hit that up again. This is on the internet. Things that are on the internet, a vulnerability scanner, and it was hitting their website and putting some junk data in the forms. Well, the junk data was then being used on other systems. And when I showed up Monday morning, this guy starts yelling at me. I'm here to do a wireless assessment. Frankly, I didn't know this external thing was even happening. And he's like, why are you writing to our SAN? Huh? Who? Me? I just got here, man. What are you talking about? He starts just absolutely unloading on me. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Come to find out, there was this external vulnerability assessment hitting the web page. The data was being sent, essentially getting written to the SAN. Now, he, for some reason, was a technical person and couldn't understand how data got from the website to some other thing internal to the network, and we had to explain that for 15 or 20 minutes. But they were using this data and sending it to the government. Now, every single one of these invalid forms cost them $1,000 in fines. There were 7,200 of these forms. That is a $7.2 million fine. And I mean, fortunately, they got out of the fine, but we put in the report that this thing happened. And they were furious, absolutely furious. This guy is screaming at me on the phone. And I told him, I'm like, quick question. Is a $7.2 million fine significant to your organization? He's like, absolutely. What would stop Vladimir in Russia from running the exact same tool and not hitting stop? What would you do? He's like, well, that's different. Is it? Because our goal is to find the vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. And if the bad guy is running this tool and your fine now is now 7.2, 8.5, right? It keeps going up and up and up, and you're not prepared for it. and your organization literally goes out of business because of it, that's business risk. That goes back to the piece at the beginning. If you're getting fined and you have no more money, you're out of business. So a little trick that's kind of to sum that is everything is a finding.
No, it's funny you say that, and we talk about this on the AMA, which will be up on YouTube this Friday. But if you want to kind of summarize real quick, the question was, do you ever not find anything exploitable within the scope of engagement? Does that make the engagement valuable or payable?
Yes. So, I mean, we had one client once, potential client, who said, hey, if you can't find anything, we're not paying. But if you do find stuff, we'll pay this. I'm like, no, we're not playing that game. Because then it's adversarial from the start and we're arguing over findings. Absolutely not. That is not something we're ever going to do. And every once in a while, I mean, apparently he gets people that bite on that. I'm not going to entertain that. But if you find an organization or you find a test where you don't have big significant findings, that's interesting. That's an interesting thing. It validates that what they're doing is good. We'll discuss this more in part 3, the reporting phase. Call that out in the report. If they are absolutely crushing it, tell them how they're crushing it. Because when it goes up to the executive and they see there's no findings, you want to say, look, you guys did a great job here. Continue doing this thing. You're doing outstanding. The other thing is make sure you're not focusing on the technical wins with quote, and you're focusing on the business wins. Mike Saunders has a fantastic blog, Finding the Silver Lining and Getting Your Teeth Kicked In, where he didn't get the technical wins, but he found other information. For example, they found a number of bank accounts and routing numbers. It wasn't all of the bank accounts and routing numbers, but I don't need that many bank accounts and routing numbers to retire in Tahiti for the rest of my life. So make sure you're focusing on the correct goal. I keep hitting on that piece over and over and over again because it's absolutely critical.
Keep an eye out for the Wednesday offensive, which will be a thing we're starting probably directly after these next 2 weeks. Appreciate everybody coming out.